Good evening, President and friends. It's a very great honour to be invited to join you this evening and introduce a discussion about a very complicated and a very timely question around religion and human rights. People often talk about the way in which, in the last 20 years or so, the discourse of human rights has often been discussed and presented in terms that some religious people find problematic and challenging. A discourse, that is the discourse of human rights, which in fact has some very interesting and very deep origins within religious ways of speaking and understanding, has, it seems, been drifting away from what some would regard as its parent territory, to the extent that now it seems as if the language of human rights and the language of religious faith are doomed to collision. There's a great deal of talk about the threats to religious freedom in our current setting in various ways. There's a great deal of talk on the other side, as it might be put, about how religion itself is a threat to human rights, to an egalitarian and inclusive view of humanity and its claims. So what I'd like to do in this very brief introduction is, first of all, to trace just a little bit of how human rights language comes to birth within a theological and philosophical tradition, and to touch on one or two of the problems that currently affect that relationship. You won't be surprised to hear that I don't have a global comprehensive solution. I'm not auditioning for the Nobel Peace Prize this evening, but I hope at least to set a few hairs running on this subject. And I begin, I'm afraid, from a very deep conviction that a lot of our current language about human rights, whether from a religious or an irreligious point of view, is colossally confused. More of that later. But let's look at a bit of the history. The idea that a human being, as such, possesses something called a jus in Latin, a claim, goes back quite a long way. The late classical and Christian philosopher Boethius, in the 6th century, speaks of the human person as existing sui juris, in their own right, with a claim, a jus, that is incommunicable to others. In other words, every human agent has a certain status, a certain expectation of a recognizable dignity. Not that jus is exactly a claim in the sense of a legally enforceable right in the ordinary sense. It's more that there is, you might say abstractly, there is something owing to every human agent at two levels. Something owing to them as a human being, something owing to them as the particular human being they are. And to speak of a human agent existing, sui juris, is to speak of that kind of recognition of humanity. Something is owed to you as a human being, something is owed to you as the particular, incommunicable, unique human being you happen to be. And through the Middle Ages, that tradition survives, and in some ways is enriched and enlarged in a number of ways by philosophical developments from the 13th century onwards. It's recognized, for example, recognized very clearly by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, that there are certain things that can never be lawfully or rightly demanded of a human being. In other words, there may be a legitimate authority around, but that legitimate authority doesn't have the authority to tell you everything you must do. It doesn't own your insides, as we might put it. And so, for example, Thomas Aquinas says that even the enslaved person cannot, for example, be forbidden to marry and start a family. It's one of the very first, one of the very first systematically reflective critiques of how slavery can and can't work in Western intellectual history, and it sets quite a long chain of consequences going. Interesting to look at it in that context, the context of a society that still accepts some forms of enslavement, some forms of indentured labor, but is putting down a marker as to the limits in which the limits to the sense in which any human being can be said to have a relation of ownership to any other. Sui juris. The person is there in their own right. But what slightly complicates this pattern, it sounds wonderfully contemporary and liberal put like that, what complicates it slightly is, of course, that the medieval thinkers understand all this against a cosmic background. There is such a thing as justice, justitia, in the whole universe. There is a place where all of us belong. And so what is owed to each one of us is owed to what we most truly are, not just what we happen to be. Which is why in the Middle Ages you could perfectly reasonably say that a criminal has a right to be punished. In other words, when you punish a criminal, you're doing what is appropriate for the criminal. And because you're doing what is appropriate for the criminal, you're actually serving the criminal's best interests. So, not exactly a modern doctrine of individual rights as we might instinctively think, but a rather interesting parallel track to that way of thinking. And a parallel track which allows medieval thinkers especially to say that my right, the jus that I possess in my own dignity, the expectation I have of respect, is something which is bound up with my freedom to contribute to the well-being of the entire community I belong to. My freedom is a freedom to act in concert with, in conversation with other human subjects. And my right is infringed or damaged or denied when I am denied the possibility of engaging in that way and acting in that way. So that the notion of right is not simply about, you might say, everything converging on my claims. It's something about how I am released to do what I am capable of doing and give what I am capable of giving. Now, notoriously, in the wake of Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment, the three weird sisters of Western intellectual history, as some Christian theologians would see it, in the wake of that, all of this becomes much more obviously a set of individual entitlements. And the strong critique of human rights that is entered by a good many religious thinkers, theologians, and philosophers in the last half century or so, the critique of human rights is most regularly a critique of that individualist assumption. The idea that what is essential about me as a human being is that I possess a set of entitlements. Exactly how we distinguish that picture from the earlier one is a complex question, but I hope that I've given some sense of how you might develop that. There's a difference between saying, I, as an individual, am born, so to speak, with a shopping list of requirements which somebody has a duty to provide. And on the other hand, saying, I am born into an interactive society in which I have the right to expect respect and dignity, and also I have the expectation that I will be called upon and enabled to give into that community what I alone can effectively give. It's really that latter view, that religiously inflected view, that is behind a good deal of the process by which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was itself originally drawn up in the wake of the Second World War. And it's something which both critics and defenders of the human rights discourse of our day often forget. Both Protestant and Catholic thinkers were very directly involved in the drawing up of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is why, in fact, that declaration has more than you might expect in it about mutuality, about dignity, and about what I've called the releasing of capacity to act in community. The Universal Declaration is not, in fact, the shopping list view of human rights at all. It is a more substantive, a more communitarian view than that. But as time goes on, that individualist sense that I come into the world already endowed with a set of claims has been the imaginative framework in which we tend to think about human rights. And that can lead to the understandable but very problematic notion that we are continuously involved in, as you might say, discovering human rights. Up until, what should we say, the middle of the 20th century, we were not very clear about the rights of women, and now we are. Until the last decade or so, we were not very clear about the rights of trans individuals, and now we are. And whatever your views about the rights of women or the rights of trans individuals, the model of a gradual discovery of pre-existing rights or pre-existing claims is not quite adequate to what's going on. Because in terms of the basis of the law of human rights, a right now is an expectation that my freedom for certain activities will be legally guaranteed. An expectation that my freedom for certain activities will be legally guaranteed and protected. And of course, as societies change and develop, expectations change and develop, self-understandings change and develop, and people more and more understand the ways in which societies have perhaps failed to reckon with the expectations of certain groups. And so it's not so much that we have a timeless Platonic world of human rights gradually unveiled as history goes on. As history progresses, that very dangerous fiction, so that we become wiser and wiser and more attuned to universal rights. It's much more that our culture continues to evolve in such a way that we notice the ways in which expectations are created and frustrated. Or to put it another way, rights and the discourse about rights are a matter of culture as much as of law. And when we seek to think through questions about human rights, primarily in terms of legal entitlement rather than in terms of evolving culture, we can very easily get into the particular kind of standoff that seems to characterize a lot of late modernity. The inflexible, fixed and given right of community X against the inflexible, given right of community Y. Rather than asking, how do the proper expectations of two communities actually negotiate and find their way forward to a sustainable form of common life? So, beginning to wrap up these introductory remarks, I would go along with some modern religious or theological critiques of human rights to a limited extent. That is, those who've pointed out that the idea of rights as possession is a faulty model, those who've criticized the individualism of much of the talk, those who've criticized the timelessness of the models that are sometimes used. Granted all that. But I would still say that the idea of certain protections, recognitions, and dignities proper to human beings as such, the recognition that there is something owing to human beings as such, and so to each human being in their own sui juris right. That is a significant part of what makes for a sustainable and a just society. I don't think we can let go of that. And I don't think we can let go of the expectation that the laws of society will, in varying degrees, at varying paces, adjust to recognizing and guaranteeing that. But we can't have, I would say, a properly intelligible and coherent account of human rights unless we have some theories of human nature and some accounts of human culture that are more than just legal and formal. So my final point is really to underline the role of different sorts of meaning-making communities in sustaining, nourishing, and developing that sense of what is due to humanity. That's why the arts have a very significant role in the promotion and extension of human rights. That's why religious faith should continue to have a significant role in the understanding and development of human rights. We don't, you see, have a humanity that has a ready-made abstract definition. We learn about our humanity in our cultures. What enriches and enlarges our culture, our sensitivity and sensibility around what's due to human beings, that is what you might call the lifeblood of any doctrine of human rights that's more than just legal or formal. So I would hope that the alienation between the discourse of human rights and the discourse of religious faith is something we can get past. Writing about this a few years ago, I remember discussing the very eloquent and detailed critique of some kinds of rights philosophy by a theological colleague, and saying at the end that as it happened, I'd just come from a meeting with a charity I'm involved with, which looks after the interests of people who are in prison in Africa. For the record, this is Justice Defenders, a charity you all ought to hear about. And the point I wanted to make was, it's all very well to talk about the theoretical flaws in rights discourse. But if you happen to be a prisoner in a jail in southern Sudan, where you may still be chained to an iron post for many hours of the day, and in which prisoners can expect routinely to be raped by their prison guards, then the discourse of human rights is actually one of the very few things you have to hang on to, and which can be leveraged by institutions and individuals, locally and globally, to change things. And that desire to change things for the well-being and the released agency of human beings, that is where the moral lifeblood of the language of human rights is to be found. And I hope that our religious convictions will continue to provide some of the material that feeds into that ongoing flow of lifeblood. Thank you very much for listening patiently. I'll be very glad to have your questions and comments.
Thank you very much for that very thought-provoking intro, Lord Williams. I'd like to go deeper into that, but before I do so, this is Michaelmas term here in Oxford, and a lot of freshers are here, and I think it's always quite useful for them to sort of get to learn about people who are coming to the union, how things were for them when they were also at a similar stage. And of course, welcome back to Oxford. You came to study here after your theology degree at Cambridge. You were at Wadham, I recall. I was just wondering whether you think things have changed since the time you were here last.
Yes. Where do you start? When I was a graduate student here, I certainly think that levels of accountability in teaching practice were probably rather slacker than they are now. When I think of my own supervision for a doctorate, I had a wonderful supervisor, but not somebody I saw very much of who seemed to have very much idea what he wanted to do with my work. That has changed for the better. But I also think, obviously, of the unrecognizable increase in sheer diversity, social, racial, etc., that exists in the university of today. And the fact that our universities are international communities in a way they really weren't in the 70s, or not very visibly. The two things that immediately come to mind as I think back. I suppose the last thing I'd want to say about the difference is you're talking to a child of the 60s. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, you know. And of course in the 60s, I think we were encouraged, rightly or wrongly, to be very optimistic about the scale of political change that could be imagined in our lifetimes. Very optimistic. I doubt whether people would share that optimism now. At the same time, what is remarkable, and I've actually just come yesterday from some fringe events at the COP event in Glasgow, what's remarkable is that optimism is not dead. Or perhaps I should say hope isn't, more importantly. Sorry, just a few thoughts.
Thank you. Going back even further to before you chose to go to university, what was it about theology that made you want to go and study that at university?
I was very fortunate, I think, in that when I was a teenager, I belonged to a local Christian community whose parish priest quite clearly thought that thinking about God and about the purposes of God was the most intriguing and enlivening thing there could be, and everything else that was intriguing and enlivening fed into it, so that the enthusiasms I developed as a schoolboy, not least about literature and drama and politics, all converged in this. That's where these questions seem to belong. And although starting to study theology in 1968 and finding at that time that I was expected to learn Greek and Hebrew from scratch and that sort of thing, it didn't immediately strike me as the great humanistic breakthrough I've been looking for. But I stuck with it and discovered actually it did all come together, and I've never stopped believing that. And that's why I've wanted to carry on being a theologian of sorts.
Of course, studying theology in your undergrad, going further into deeper academia and studying further theology, then practicing as an archbishop in theology. Later on, I believe you married a theologist. Clearly, theology is something you're clearly passionate about. I wonder how the world is like for you in your home life now. Are there aspects that are outside theology which you're exploring now that you are not as, I guess, active in certain theologist realms?
Interesting question. I suppose I'd have to go back to my first answer, really. Everything comes back to it. Everything connects at some stage and at some level. What I do sense, of course, especially since I stopped being an archbishop, and I very much like your phrase, practicing as an archbishop, because I don't think I ever quite managed to do it. I kept practicing, but never quite mastered it. It does mean that when I speak in public, it's not quite in the same representative capacity, and you don't feel quite the same enormous foot poised over your head that you can do when you're speaking in a representative capacity. So it's been a time since I stopped being archbishop to explore a bit in writing in other ways. I've been publishing poetry for quite a long time. I've done a bit more of that, and writing a little bit more broadly. The New Statesman, bless their hearts, have given me a regular opportunity of writing reviews and articles for them. So yes, pushing the boat out a bit, but it's still, it still joins up at the back.
Thank you. in your opening remarks, you spoke a lot about human rights and outlining different ways in which you think they're brought about and what they consist of. Notably, you mentioned how human rights are about culture, and given that you recently just come back from Glasgow with COP26 just occurring, I wondered what you thought about animal rights and perhaps the culture of eating meat, especially in the context of its effect in the industrial scale to our planet.
It's a very interesting question, because when I was thinking about how to introduce the subject, I did wonder, should I talk about animal rights? Because clearly, talking about animal rights is not like the way we talk about human rights. I talked about the expectation of our freedoms being protected. And probably the average cow doesn't think in quite those terms. And what we're talking about, therefore, where animal rights are concerned, is something more about our expectation of how others will treat other bits of the environment we're part of. And I think the sense that there might even be such a thing as environmental rights as well as animal rights. What we're talking about, again, is something to do with that old medieval and pre-medieval model. There is a kind of activity, a kind of attitude, which is appropriate here. That's to say, it fits with where we belong in the world. And the abuse of our environment that we've inherited is, you could say, putting it mildly, a deeply inappropriate, unjust form of relationship. So not quite the modern idea of expectation, but it crosses over. And I think it's perhaps a mistake to move to an over-simple discourse of animal rights as if it were just an extension of human rights. We do need a comprehensive picture of how we fit in the universe, seeing ourselves, our human selves, as part of, not 6 feet above the rest of it. So to the specific question, and speaking as a vegetarian, I do think one of the ways in which we can effectively respond to the crisis we face is reducing our meat consumption. I say that also conscious of the way in which there are two aspects of the present position we're in which need to be recognized. One is, as I think you were hinting, one is the problem of massive industrialized abusive meat production. Abusive of animals, abusive of the soil used to create a sort of standard fodder. That's in itself an abusive set of practices, an unjust set of practices. The reduction of our meat consumption is, I think, a necessary corollary of that. At the same time, I'm aware that there are farmers, small farmers around the place, local agricultural practitioners whose practices are not abusive, not cruel. I don't want to see such a wave of vegetarian enthusiasm as to put them on the poverty line in the next 6 months. Now, how one squares those circles, I don't know, but I have those two things in my mind as I think about this problem. And it's one reason why I don't want to be too evangelistic about, veganism for everybody next week. There are transitional questions, there are questions of proportion, and there are questions of both human and animal sustainability in the short to middle term that have to be factored in there.
Thank you. Rights, according to you, are about culture, but also equally about law. And I thought to get your thoughts on what your perception is about perhaps the recent legal actions to sort of redefine certain laws that do affect people's human rights, or what would describe as their human rights, such as the right to protest and the government's recent reforms to reform it to some degree. Where does that fall for you in your category of human rights, and does violation of that in any semantic sense affect it?
When we talk about the right to protest, I think we're talking about one version of what I think I described in my opening remarks as the freedom to act, to be a participant in the society we're in. Protest is not always the most effective form of political involvement, but it is certainly part of a spectrum of political engagement. I worry about the constraints that are being placed on the right to protest. I worry very seriously about that, and I think it's part of a systematic nervousness about participatory politics in our time. I'm not an anarchist. I believe that good government is a good we should pursue. I think that the restriction of any kind of right to contribute to the process of governance is deeply undesirable and threatening.
Thank you. You're also quite well known for your progressive views. I highlighted earlier on how you notably attempted to allow the appointment of women as bishops in the Church of England. I wonder how you respond to your comments in September when you spoke out against the assisted suicide bill, and just pulling on to your views during your opening speech about human rights being about dignity, capacity, and this fall under a universal declaration of what human rights should be. Why would you say that people who are experiencing excruciating pain shouldn't have the right to choose to end that?
It's one of those areas where, as in so many bits of our social practice, there are balances to be sought. And when I wrote what I did about the assisted suicide debate, one of the things I did want to say there was my personal reasons for opposing assisted suicide are religious. But of course, I don't have the right as a religious person to impose my conscience on society. But there are those who don't share that religious conviction, who would say there is a serious rights issue involved on both sides of the debate. So you may say there's a right to end my life at a point of my choosing, in the sense that everybody has that freedom in some way. Well, obviously, in the sense that there is an expectation that society will facilitate that becomes a little bit more questionable. If there's a move in law to say certain sorts of condition are, if you like, prima facie good grounds for ending life, that begins to affect what we say about people living with disabilities of various kinds or terminal illnesses, people with Down syndrome. And it's those groups who have very often been most vocal in resisting a legalization of assisted suicide, which would, if you like, carry with it the presumption that some kinds of life are not worth living. So there's a rights question there as well. And it's that balance which is difficult. Now, how long that public consensus against assisted suicide will last, I don't know. It looks to me as if the tide is flowing in one direction. And if that's the way it goes, I shall regret it, and I shall want to go on arguing against it. But of course, the processes of law and lawmaking will take their course. I just want to be sure that some real risks are named and thought through in this process, and that we have good answers to questions about the liberties and the dignity of the disabled and so on.
Yeah, thank you. On the topic of disabilities, I know that we live in a world where people are trying their best to be much more inclusive. Businesses and corporations and government and education institutions are trying their best to do so. Do you think that we live in a world which is, in its design, actively not going to be considerate for especially minorities, but especially like disabled people? Or do you think we live in a world whereby we're much more progressing towards fixing that?
I think we're living in a world which is fraught with contradictions about this. On the one hand, we have a far deeper, but very welcome sensitivity to the needs of people living with disabilities. You asked me about changes from my time as a student. Well, that was an era when anybody with any sort of physical challenge would find it 20 times more difficult to negotiate the average staircase in an Oxford college than, well, I won't say than they do now, because those staircases are still there, aren't they? But there are alternatives. People have thought through a bit what the challenges are, what the restrictions on properly expected freedoms are. So, we've moved on. And that's wonderful. We have become more sensitive to the ways in which people are excluded from participation by physical disability, mental health issues, and so on. At the same time, we are a culture which, it seems, is driven by models and myths of achievement, success, and acquisition that push in exactly the opposite direction. We have an advertising world which still canonizes certain kinds of physical fitness and beauty. And you won't need me to underline the fact that there is a racial element to that too. We are deeply, deeply divided, I think, culturally on this. We like to think we are becoming more inclusive, and yet the stories we tell ourselves about what counts as success and what counts as control of our environment are still skewed towards people with certain sorts of normative identity and ability. And I don't see much sign of our really facing that contradiction and pushing back against some of the myths that we're sold.
Yeah. On the topic of, how divided we are and how we have different communities that we need to sort of like get much more intertwined with, you're someone who, in addition to being very well learned, has read 9 languages, so therefore broken many barriers in communication. I wonder why, and I also wonder how has this enriched your life?
There's something to be said for growing up in a bilingual environment. I wasn't brought up in the medium of Welsh, but Welsh was always spoken around me in home and family. And I've sometimes said that one of the things I give thanks for in that is that I was aware from early on that there was always going to be another way of saying something, and became fascinated by the different ways of saying things, which I suppose disposed me to be interested in languages, interested in translation, and also interested at a rather more theoretical level in the way in which it's impossible to say everything at once. I know that sounds such a blindingly obvious thing to say, but the recognition that I can only say what I want or need to say when someone else is saying what they want or need to say, and that together something larger emerges, a commitment, if you like, to conversation and the discovery that comes with that. I think all that is part of the interest in languages and part of what a partly bilingual background stirred for me.
Excited. You corrected me, you agreed with me with the phrasing practicing Archbishop earlier. So I'll be careful not to say you were Archbishop. But so whilst you were practicing Archbishop as the Archbishop of Canterbury for 10 years, what was the most surprising element of your role?
Sorry, the most surprising?
Yeah.
2 things, perhaps. One was the amount of time and energy that had to be given to interfaith work. Not that I had no experience of it, but I don't think I'd expected it would be such an enormous investment of thought and practice, and I'm glad of that. Because I became Archbishop not very long after 9/11, then issues around the interfaith discussion were always there. I was privileged to be on very friendly terms with the Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, and one of the events I'll always remember is going with Jonathan to Auschwitz, leading a group of other faith leaders, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and the two of us as a Jew and a Christian leading that trip to Auschwitz. That was well, to say stretching is an understatement, but it was one of those things that quite rightly put pressure on all of us to think, to feel, to understand one another better and to understand the history better. So that was a surprise. I suppose I was also a bit surprised, I shouldn't have been, a bit surprised by just how curious a fairy tale figure the Archbishop of Canterbury is in the English mind. The Archbishop of Canterbury still has this sort of odd mythical role as the spokesperson for English Christianity, and when he gets it wrong, as I frequently did, the heavens fall. Very strange. And I was saying to one of you earlier, one of the lessons you learn in a public job like that is you're always talking to everybody. You think you're giving a lecture to this group and suddenly it's all over the front page of the Daily Mail. You think you're writing a nice little reflection for the diocesan newsletter for the parishioners to read, and there's a critical editorial about it in the Times. You think, oh, dear Lord. So that was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I'd like to delve more into your memories with Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, because you wrote about him, you wrote a moving piece about him last year, and in it you spoke about that memory. And I wanted to delve more into what you think about the way religious people and religions live alongside each other in the United Kingdom today, especially in the context of what's occurred in recent times, both current affairs and internationally.
Another surprise, you could say, when I was traveling was the number of people abroad who, especially in the continent of Europe, who would say it looks as if interreligious relations in the UK are better than they are here. Now, I don't want to make exaggerated claims about that, but I do think that actually at both grassroots level and leadership level, there was a remarkable amount of convergence and collaboration. We were able, from the Archbishop's office, to convene, for example, a round table of religiously based development agencies. So Jewish, Islamic, Sikh, Hindu development and relief agencies coming together to talk about our understanding of international aid and development. And doing so in a very collaborative, not a competitive spirit. We were able on some occasions to get leadership to make joint statements about big public issues, coming together when the Iraq War began to say some rather unenthusiastic things about it together. We were able to launch a national Christian-Muslim forum whose purpose was to foster and resource locally focused interfaith community activism, looking at what the local issues were that communities could collaborate on. So all of that, I think, was very positive. And it was all the harder then when some people in the media, some people indeed in the churches at times, would say, well, you shouldn't be wasting your energies on interfaith matters when what this country needs with its Christian heritage is strong statements of Christian principle. I've said more than once before that I got a bit suspicious of people saying what we need from you, Archbishop, is leadership, when what they really meant is what we need from you, Archbishop, is what we're saying.
Finally, I'd like to touch on something you touched on earlier on about how, as Archbishop of Canterbury, the fairy tale role requires you to almost speak to the world and everyone, never just the room or someone personally. This summer, you wrote for the New Statesman and about the Brexit referendum. You said basically it was always a way. Was always in search of a problem. What did you mean by that?
Yes, it's a phrase I used in this piece, saying, Brexit felt to me like a solution in search of a problem. That's to say, it wasn't that there were a number of clearly identifiable issues to which leaving the European Union was the clear argued answer. But here was, if you like, an iconic flagship policy which rallied quite a number of people imaginatively without it ever being quite clear what it was supposed to be dealing with concretely. And I think that's one of the real challenges of modern politics, that with the information overload and the short attention span that everybody talks about, it's quite easy to say, well, here is a flag that we're running up. It'll make you feel good, rather than saying, so what exactly are the issues we need to solve? Where are the problems to be identified? And when I think of a number of the sort of culture war standoff issues that are around, I mentioned trans rights and the current shark pool of controversy around how that fits with, if you like, classical feminist theory. I want to ask in that context, can we just for a moment step back and say, what are the very specific unfreedoms or disadvantages or issues or cruelties or injustices that we want to resolve, and how do we find some will together to resolve them, rather than instantly rushing for the corners of the room, as somebody put it. But yeah, I'm not holding my breath about that.
Before moving on to audience questions, I wanted to make note of the fact that you were a member of the House of Lords for 7 years. You're not shy to public speaking. You're someone who's quite dear to the public hearts as Archbishop of Canterbury, who's been quite progressive, and your words are featured in places like the Times. And we are at the Oxford Union, and it's a safe space for talking about these kind of things. Did you ever consider a career in politics?
Absolutely never. I thought about social work, I thought about secondary school teaching. At one wild point, I thought about the theatre, but not politics.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor to audience questions. I'd like to remind audience members that please wait till the microphone has been given to you before speaking, and start with your name and college. I recognize the speaker with a black shirt on the front benches.
Hello, thank you very much. I was wondering, as a faith leader in Christianity and who has also met faith leaders in other faiths, do you think there is some shared personalities between faith leaders despite they belong to different faiths? And what do you think that is?
Shared personalities.
Yeah, like personal qualities.
I see, right, yes, thank you. What an interesting question. Tempting to say one obvious quality that faith leaders share is a lack of realism about their limitations, otherwise they wouldn't say yes to the job. But in all seriousness, I think there has to be, and this is perhaps what I'd like to see rather than what I would always see, but the great faith leaders I know, the people who understand there has to be a real awareness of what ordinary lives of faith are like, a willingness to be there alongside. I think there has to be a proper level of detachment from immediate success or impact, because it really doesn't help anyone in this position to spend all their time on Twitter in the hope that a certain number of likes per day will make you feel you've done it. You have to have, I think, a feeling that it is important to put down markers, even if you're not quite certain where that will lead. Just to say, well, this is where we come from, this is where we are. And not to expect that you'll win all the arguments. And that, to me, is what faith entails. When people talk to me about the vulnerability or the weakness of the church, my instinct is to say, well, of course, but we're not in this business of church or mosque or synagogue or whatever because we think the institution is so massively impressive. That would be a huge delusion. We're in this because we think that God wants us to be. And that's the end of it, really. And you don't trust the institution, you trust the God that the institution serves. So I think to be, in any sense, a faith leader with any integrity or rootedness, you'd have to have a bit of all those going on.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the member with the grey jacket on the second row.
In the beginning of your talk, you talked about the debates on Christianity being seen as a threat to human rights. And one of the things is like Christianity based its understanding of human rights from some of the fundamental texts that has received. And now you have also mentioned sometimes these texts are the institutions for understanding of Christianity. So I come from the Orthodox background, and in which our understanding of the text and the implication of human rights would be different from the Church of England, perhaps. So then, would you advocate that these texts are institutions, just like the Church, and hence our interpretation of this text should be different from our understanding of the individual relationship with God?
Complex question. I think institutions are unavoidable. We talk to one another about our convictions and our beliefs, and once we start talking, we have to organize our talking in some ways and transmit wisdom, or what we think might be wisdom, from generation to generation. We fall into institutional habits, of course we do. And so I'm not really wanting to sit light in that sense, or say we can do without institutions. It's a matter of priority. But I think you were also asking about the different ways in which different church institutions might approach questions of rights. And I think that's one of the most challenging questions that we face. Certainly when I was Archbishop, to take the obvious example, a substantial part of our international church, the Anglican Communion, believed very strongly that recognizing the human dignity of lesbian and gay and other sexual minority people entailed accepting them for ordination and so forth. A very large part, a majority of our community thought otherwise. And balancing, well, I wouldn't say balancing, but just attempting to manage the ferocity of debate on that subject was certainly one of the things which increased the grey hairs on my head. My concern in that context was, I suppose, twofold, and I think it would apply across different churches as well. I think it is actually utterly imperative that any Christian recognizes that people who identify as belonging to sexual minorities are recognized as human beings with the dignity that belongs to human beings, that there is an appropriate, a just response to such persons. They should not be persecuted, they should not be imprisoned, and that's the bottom line here. And with some difficulty, I did manage to persuade a majority of the archbishops of the communion to sign up to that as a basic principle. Within that, we go on arguing about the moral understanding of same-sex relations. I would put myself personally on the liberal end of that spectrum, but I believed also that we would have to keep talking to people who didn't share that view, if only to try to focus on how we went on learning together from one another, rather than simply saying, well, the West or the North has all the wisdom and the global South has all the tradition and the benightedness. That's no good. But if you're going to do that kind of sustained discernment and exploration, it's very hard work and it does chew you up rather. So I don't think there's a short answer to the question, but it's a good one.
Thank you very much. I must apologize. That concludes the Q&A section today. Before I conclude, I'd like to remind us all to please stay seated until myself and the speaker have exited the chamber. If we could all do that, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much for visiting us today, Lord Williams. It's been a genuine pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.